I almost said good morning, so good afternoon, right? It is afternoon. So we're going to focus, obviously, in this roughly 45 to 50 minutes we'll have together on some tools that you can utilize that are really focused in on universal Tier 1 approaches, and in particular, trauma-informed approaches as they pertain to classroom practice. The session is geared primarily for coaches, internal or external coaches for PBIS implementation. But the nature of the content we'll cover will also have relevance to anybody else that's involved in classroom-based practice. I am curious, though, and I was sharing up front here, I really expected to have a smaller population of people that were actually coaches looking to implement these tools. So having this many people interested in this is both surprising and very exciting to hear, to say the least. So this is not kind of a general classroom management presentation that I've done historically over the years here at the forum, but this is really honed in on actual tools you can use and primarily built in a self-reflective manner. So with that, how many of you are actually either internal or external coaches for PBIS implementation in a school? Show of hands. So a good portion of you still. Now for those of you that are not formally coaches, that doesn't mean that what we're going to cover here won't have relevance for you, but that's helpful for me to kind of gauge a little bit as we move along. So the three primary targets for you folks coming out of here will be the following. Be able to describe in your own words these grab-and-go Tier 1 resources that are available, to be identify how to access them, and all of these are uploaded onto the app for the forum, but they're also available on the McDowell Institute website, at Commonwealth University at the Bloomsburg University campus. And then depending on where we are on time as we move along here, I'll provide some opportunities for you to do maybe a little quick pair share conversation in terms of, based on what I orient you towards in terms of these resources, how you could see utilizing these to further enhance your practices in coaching PBIS implementation. And I do know one of the real challenges with that coaching practice is actually looking at classroom-based application of positive behavior support in the instructional settings as well as the non-instructional settings in buildings. So first of all, though, context. Why is trauma-informed classroom practices so important? I ask this question every time I come to the forum. Each year the percentage gets a little higher, so I'm going to venture to ask it again. How many of you in here are reasonably familiar with the Pennsylvania Youth Survey or the PAYS? Real show of hands. A higher percentage without question. I used to ask that question about 4 years ago, and I'd get 1 or 2 hands popping up in the back of the room here and there. So that's good. That's really encouraging news. The PAYS is a wealth of information for us when we're talking about social, emotional, behavioral wellness for kids, which is in many instances a prerequisite for academic achievement in terms of addressing the whole needs of a child. These are excerpted data from the most recent administration where the data are publicly available. I know that the PAYS 23 is being implemented this fall, either a little earlier or as we speak, depending on your school. Those data will not be publicly available, though, until about April or May of this year coming up. These are state-level data, and they are just a few of the excerpted data points, but they kind of clearly punctuate why trauma-informed practice and why Tier 1 approaches have always been important, but are absolutely essential now for us as educators. When we look at these data points, particularly considered suicide in the last 12 months, approaching 1 out of every 5 kids in 2021 indicated that they had seriously considered suicide within the last 12 months. Now, as alarming as that is, if we go down to this latter data point that's here, the item or the stem that reads essentially, this is paraphrased a bit for brevity, felt very sad or hopeless for at least 2 weeks, to the point that I stopped doing the usual activities that I engage in. That is a risk factor for clinical depression. Not saying it is clinical depression, to be clear. I'm an educator, I'm not a mental health specialist, I'm not diagnosing anything here. but I'm saying that is absolutely a risk factor related to potential clinical depression. Approaching 1 out of every 3 6th, 8th, 10th, and 12th graders in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania that participated in the PAYS in 2021 responded affirmatively to that. That is frightening. And I know for those of you that are classroom teachers or those that work directly with classroom teachers, you not just see this, you live this every single day with lots and lots of kids in your classroom. So this really makes the point of why trauma-informed approaches, and in particular, I would argue Tier 1 approaches, are absolutely essential. So of course, it's the tip of the iceberg. These are just some data points we were looking at. The solution set is finding this balance, understanding and creating the balance between what are referred to as protective factors and risk factors in kids' lives. Simply defined, a protective factor is something that's present or a series of things that are present in a kid's life that increase the likelihood of desired outcomes. Risk factors are things that are present in a kid's life that increase the likelihood of undesired outcomes. Now, we could get much more technical with definitions, but in a nutshell, that's the difference between a risk and a protective factor, right? Now, the key for us as educators is we want the school experience to become a protective factor in the lives of the kids that we work with. But a kid coming to school, just coming to the physical location of school, is not inherently a protective or a risk factor by itself. It depends on what happens in that kid's experience while they're at school. That's what will sway it one way or the other. Now, there's lots of risk and protective factors that are outside of the realm of what we can directly influence as educators, and in particularly as classroom teachers. But the one area, our sweet spot, the place where we have the greatest amount of influence, I won't say control, but I will say influence, is what goes on day in and day out in our classrooms with the kids we have in our classroom, either during the class period, if I'm a high school teacher or secondary level, or middle school, or my self-contained group if I'm in the younger grades or the primary grades. So let me ask this basic question of you. And I'm going to ask you to raise your hand and keep it up just for a moment. I won't have you stand up because we don't have a lot of time here. How many of you are involved in a school or multiple schools where there is an acknowledgement and a concern about increasing mental health problems with kids? Okay, because if you don't have your hand up, I really want to interview you. I mean, I want to know what's going on there. It must be the water. It really must be. So here's the challenge, though, with this. When we think about multi-tiered systems of support and PBIS implementation, multiple tiers, right? When we talk about mental health challenges with kids and the increasing degree of those things that are occurring, whether it's reflected in the PAYS data or you look at national data or the Center for Disease Control data, whatever data set you're looking at, the bottom line is kids are having greater and greater mental health challenges in their lives, right? So that's a reality. So understandably, what can kind of absorb, if not all, most of the attention is identifying and recognizing and acknowledging we don't have enough mental health services that exist in our society. If they exist, there's waiting lists. If there's waiting lists, it's hard to access them. It's hard to navigate the healthcare system, insurance, not insurance, Medicaid, whatever, right? It's complicated. What we're going to talk about here today isn't going to address that, but I do want to acknowledge it because Tier 1 practices alone will not address this concern we have as a society. However, advanced tier supports alone will also not address this concern we have as a society. What we need to focus on, particularly as classroom teachers, are what are the things that we have the most direct influence on that we know serve as the foundation for healthy learning environments for kids. When you build a house, the first thing that gets poured or built is what? The foundation. Well, the foundation of trauma-informed practice is what goes on in the classroom at Tier 1. And I would argue as a field, and I'm an educator, I'm a teacher by training, as a field, we have not done as well as we probably needed to and are capable of doing in operationalizing. When we think about expectations with kids, right? Clarity, what does it look like? What does it sound like? We haven't done as clean a job with that when it comes down to what are those classroom instructional strategies that are Tier 1 strategies that are beneficial to all kids and are absolutely critical as the foundation for any kid that's navigating a mental health challenge in their life. So that's where these grab-and-go resources have emerged from, is trying to acknowledge that need to operationally make this more clear and more concrete and more tangible and more sequential, almost task analyzed, so to speak, but not necessarily in a trail of breadcrumbs, because life's never that easy, right? So that's where these resources have kind of come from. So let me overview for you what these resources are that are totally free and available to you guys to utilize. And then I'll show you examples of them. I will not read them verbatim to you, but I will kind of orient you with this. So all of these practices that are listed here, each of these have a concrete, tangible tool that teachers can use as a self-check. It's a reflective professional development experience that they can use as a self-check with respect to these core, what we would describe as core Tier 1 trauma-informed approaches. Now, the really good news is that there isn't anything on here that people have never heard about before. Rapport building, reinforcement, expectations with social emotional learning that align with PA career ready skills, use of pre-correction procedures, opportunities to respond. None of this is new stuff. But what these tools help us to do is to make them more concrete and tangible in a way that you can differentiate how someone utilizes these based on where their educational practice is at that moment in time. By that, what I mean is, for example, we use these tools in internships with pre-service educators as they're just learning at the front end of the professional developmental curve. How do I deliver systematic reinforcement? How do I achieve a 4-to-1 ratio, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. However, those same skills and the same tool is also applicable and useful for those of us in the field that are practicing teachers. For those that have been teaching for a while and are very efficient in their delivery of these instructional practices, you can utilize these tools as a periodic self-check. It's kind of like taking your pulse once in a while, just to kind of see, how am I doing with this practice? How am I doing with this practice? It's not designed in a way that it's remedial in nature by any means. However, for someone who's struggling with some aspect of, say, professional practice, maybe it's delivery of reinforcement and achieving that 4-to-1 ratio with whole group as well as with each individual kid. It can be utilized more frequently and on a more periodic basis, and perhaps coupled with, if needed, some coaching and modeling to help that person regain the skill sets that they had, but for whatever reason have gotten maybe a little bit rusty with them. So the tools I'm going to overview here are just that. They are tools. There's a lot of things that need to go into the thought process of how these tools are shared, utilized, facilitated, and implemented. That's the process side of it. We're not going to talk about that today because that's going to look different from building to building to building, and perhaps from teacher to teacher to teacher within any given building. But these tools line up as following. Kind of the mothership of the tool, or the tool package, is this first one, Trauma-Informed Classroom Management Self-Assessment, the Baker's Dozen at the very top. Okay, so the Baker's Dozen lays out questions or stems of questions for teachers to reflect on following an instructional targeted block that they self-identified. The component parts that are reflected in the baker's dozen, which I'll show you in a moment because it's one page, it's not like voluminous, are comprised of the following core skill sets: rapport building, pre-correction, positive reinforcement, OTRs, and redirection if it's relevant during the targeted classroom block. Then beyond the baker's dozen, where all of these are in one self-reflective tool, we've taken each of these component parts and created micro self-assessments. So if I'm a teacher and let's say I utilize the baker's dozen on a couple of occasions throughout the course of, say, the fall of a school year, and I'm like, it seems like I'm doing, based on this, I'm doing pretty well in these areas. I wasn't doing as well in OTRs as I thought I might have been or what I feel I should be. So there is a micro self-assessment that just drills a little deeper just on OTRs. Or if it's not OTRs, it drills down on pre-correction that's utilized prior to kids engaging in an activity during an instructional block, or rapport building, or whatever the circumstance might be. So the micro self-assessments drill a little deeper in a singular component that's reflected in the larger baker's dozen. So someone could start by using the baker's dozen and maybe just utilize that because there aren't any major things that leap off to them and they're good, and periodically they use it as a self-check. However, if something jumps off, you can migrate over and say, I'm going to try a micro self-assessment a couple of times. And if nothing else, what it does is it helps pre-correct ourselves, right? When we think about pre-correction, it's really a pre-correction procedure for us in that it helps us to be more deliberative about, I thought I was doing either good depth or breadth with my OTRs or frequency, but I need to kind of hone in on that a little bit more. So now I'm going to become a bit more deliberative in my planning process, a little bit more deliberative in my instructional delivery, so to speak, to really try to ramp up or emphasize OTRs a little bit more in this example. Then moving beyond the micro self-assessments, there are also a series of what are self-paced skill building activities. In general, I would suggest these are going to be more aligned with either one, clearly pre-service educators, two, early career educators that for whatever reason, based on whatever educator prep program they came from, if certain component skills are not as present as what would be desired or they would desire, that they can kind of go through some reflective activities given some hypothetical situations. Or three, if there is remedial need, these could be used to help to further enhance that, but done in a relatively self-paced, asynchronous manner. So the tools have been deliberately designed on our part to be able to be flexible, to be used by any practitioner at any stage of their professional practice as it pertains to classroom delivery of instruction with kids. So the focal point, of course, is teachers, but it could be utilized or applicable to other individuals as well that go in and out working with kids. So let me having given you that kind of quick preview or orientation of this, let me orient you to these tools. This is the baker's dozen. Again, these are all up on the app. These are all available on our website. And it simply lays out a series of 13 questions. And each of these tools, the baker's dozen, the micro self-assessments, each of them have a one-page guidance sheet that precede it, that give the teacher or the person some guidance on different ways that they can go about planning to utilize the tool. So with the baker's dozen, say I'm a 10th grade geometry teacher or whatever it is, I might say, I'm gonna pick period 2 this week and period 5 next week, and then after I go through instruction on that, I'm simply going to, in a self-reflective fashion, think back through what I just experienced in my instructional practice and self-evaluate. And then there's a simple code at the bottom. Those core component parts of rapport building, expectations, pre-correction, OTRs, redirection. They are embedded into particular items on this 13-item, one-page self-reflective sheet. Now, as I had mentioned before, with the micro self-assessments, all they do is they take 1 or 2 items off of the baker's dozen, they pull it out, and they expand and drill down a little deeper. So, for example, with rapport building, and all of the micro self-assessments are organized so they look the same on the surface. 5 items. Same type of Likert type reflective scale. Scale varies a little bit depending on the practice, especially with redirection. You'll see that when you look at them in greater depth. But it simply breaks it down further. So like with rapport building, I greeted my students in general as they entered the room, et cetera, et cetera. I deliberately greeted particular students that appear more vulnerable or at risk. In other words, this helps me as a guide to be more deliberative about not just approaching rapport building in general as I understand it as an educator, but to understand that I need to be strategic about it and thoughtful about it with those kids that are perhaps more vulnerable for lack of success. Because rapport is a great example of this. What will logically and naturally happen is that if periodically I'm not deliberative about targeting rapport building with those kids that appear more vulnerable or at greatest risk, or another way to say it is the kids I feel less connected with, what's going to naturally happen is I'll build rapport with lots of kids, but I'll gravitate mostly towards the kids that make me feel the best about myself as a teacher. That's human nature. It's not a bad thing. It's just something to acknowledge and be aware of. These tools can help us to kind of navigate through the human frailty that we have, which is a good thing, as educators. Beyond rapport building, there is a micro self-assessment on pre-correction procedures in the classroom, one on positive reinforcement, and on the micro self-assessment, it focuses in on achieving a 4-to-1 ratio whole group, as well as a 4-to-1 ratio with each and every individual student. OTRs, again, all designed and formatted very similarly, and then also redirecting undesired behavior. And with the redirection procedures, it's differentiated between self-reflection on when an undesired behavior occurs, the first decision we need to make instructionally is, okay, is this nuisance level or is this problem level behavior? Because those two different packages or types of behaviors require different responses from me for redirection. If it's nuisance level, I should be using planned ignoring. If it's a problem behavior, I need to be using a very direct stop redirect procedure. And that interpretation of is this nuisance or is this problem is a subjective decision because I'm making it on the fly. So another thing to be aware of, and a little bit of the narrative gets into this, is if I'm feeling more resilient at a given point in time, I'm more likely to be more accurate in my assessment of nuisance or problem. If I'm worn down, tired, beat up, and feel unloved, almost everything under the sun is going to look like a problem behavior on that day. But that helps me, again, to be more in tune with self-monitoring and self-regulating my instructional practice. Now, by way of quick review back to the whole package, we've only talked about the baker's dozen, or I should say I've only oriented you to the baker's dozen as well as the micro self-assessments. We haven't gotten into the self-paced tools yet. What I want to do is give you a moment here to simply, in a moment, not right away, turn with a partner and just talk a little bit about, based on this quick orientation of these tools, how could you see possibly this being of use to you in either your coaching endeavors, or if you're not a coach but you're a teacher in a classroom, how could you see utilizing these tools potentially on a periodic basis? Going to give you about maybe 3-4 minutes tops to talk about it. I'll use a visual cue to bring you back to the ranch. I'll give you about a 1 minute, 30-second, and then a 15-second, and then a 5-second countdown on hand. Okay, don't even need the countdown. Great. Thanks. Okay, I'm curious. Quick thoughts of things you talked about. What are some either ways that you could see utilizing this? Because there's not just like, here's the way it has to be done and it's verbatim scripted and it's the only way to do it. These tools are built for generalizability or flexibility, right? So they can be utilized lots and lots and lots of ways. And I'm sure probably ways beyond even what we've imagined utilizing them to date. What were some things that you identified in terms of ways you could utilize, and or if any questions emerged about what we've looked at thus far that you might have? Please, real loud.
We liked the fact that it was like non-punitive and it was self-assessment. So we try to have monthly goals for our staff. So we can present to them, okay, this is what we're working on this month. Take a look at it. Each statement is really clear. It's a yes or no. It doesn't get into the gobbledygook of alphabet soup.
Right, the jargon.
People can just really look at it and do yes or no and say, and they also, each statement suggests what you should be doing.
Okay, so I'm going to reframe for the recording here. That's why I was checking, so I was listening to you, not like daydreaming off into the sky. That the primary focus was that they're stated positively and they are non-punitive in nature, and that they're relatively clear, they're not exhaustive, and they're, generally speaking, common language for us as teachers, not a lot of gobbledygook or jargon in there. There is, you know, I don't know if a lay person would pick this up and be able to like read it and interpret it, but that's not the intended user, so to speak. Fair enough? Okay, thank you. How about others? Other things that either came to mind. Please, real loud.
So we talked about utilizing this all throughout the year and at different points checking back in, matching groups of teachers up based on areas where they felt like they had a weakness, and then bringing in other training and support to address those weaknesses, and then check back in maybe mid-year, and then again at the end of the year, and just kind of see what the progress looks like over the course of the school year.
So again, the comment was looking at utilizing it throughout the course of the year, and then clustering or creating quasi-cohorts, I guess, you didn't use the term, but I will, of teachers where they're packaged together, where they're coming together and doing spot checks. I think you had indicated perhaps if it was an area where there might be remedial needs, which makes absolute sense. You could also do it just in a more proactive manner too, using a professional learning community approach, where it becomes a focus of PLCs, where faculty are essentially, you know, looking at the tools, utilizing them, coming back, sharing experiences with them, and then kind of progressively building momentum along those lines. So they can be used remedially, but they can also be used more preventatively as well, just as a proactive kind of spot check. How about anybody else? Something? Yes, please. Right, so the comment is on just the objective nature of the statements as well. So it doesn't put you in a position, say if you're a facilitator or a coach, of coming off as judgmental, in that the language is pretty third-personish, so to speak. It's pretty straightforward, it's relatively clear. Yeah, there's nuances in there still. And the other point, which I think is really a great point that you mentioned, is that whether you're actually scoring it or not, the only, or I don't want to say the only, the primary reason why we kept a scoring rubric at the bottom was for teachers that would pick it up and use it themselves with no coaching. So it gives them some degree of a little bit of feedback or guidance. But you're absolutely right, that if you're there to coach and guide, you don't have to worry about the numerical score because it's not equating to anything. Right? It's really a spot check to get a finger on the pulse of what's going on with practice, whether it's the baker's dozen in the broadest sense or particular strategies or component strategies reflected in the baker's dozen through the micro self-assessments. Yeah. Yeah, we're harder the older we get. I know I am. I mean, you know, habits... The nice thing, too, about this is not new stuff. But I would argue, depending on how this is framed, that's important to acknowledge. up front, depending on how you're applying this, is that these are not new things and you have to forget about things that you learned about 20 years ago or you've been using for 20 years even to date. But it's a question of further honing and refining our practice. And the reason why this is so critical, and it's easy to lose sight of, is that these Tier 1 approaches are the foundation for the school experiences for kids to have that be, in their lives, a protective factor. Just as the opposite, if these things are not in place, if the foundation of the house is not stable, it increases the likelihood that, one, you might get an artificial increase that wouldn't naturally be there of kids that appear that are struggling, say, with mental health challenges or behaviors because the structures aren't in place. And two, if these things are not in place, it does not create a healthy, conducive environment for those kids that are, in fact, experiencing and navigating mental health challenges in their lives. So in the PBIS world, as we've talked about, Tier 1 practices are critical, they're essential, they're important, but I don't think we've really talked about them. We're doing more about this, I want to be clear, but I don't think we've talked clearly enough about them, of how they are the core basis of social emotional well-being with kids, at least in terms of what we can influence as classroom teachers. Now, the last set of resources I want to highlight very quickly for you are these grab-and-go self-paced skill-building activities. So this packet is about a 15-page packet, if I'm not mistaken. And there's a little bit more narrative and description because it's primarily focused on either pre-service or people that might be struggling with a component aspect of practice, to give them a little bit more guidance and example. And then each one of those domains end up with some type of self-reflective exercise in them, just for a little bit of drill and practice. So, for example, this is the rapport building one, and this is the culminating piece on that component part of this 15-page packet. Gives a little bit of a description of a situation, and then if I'm going through this, I would come up with rapport building strategies that would be very targeted to work with this kiddo, Ryan, who's a 5th grader, and then I would also identify when I would look at that. So we give them enough information so that they can kind of dabble or swim around with it and make it a bit more concrete. Same thing applies with embedding social emotional learning and PA career ready skills within our behavior matrices or our expectations. So we give them guidance, a little bit of narrative, not a ton, not heavy in jargon, pretty common language or descriptions. And then we give them some examples. So here are the prior expectations to be enhanced, like use your own materials, pick up clutter, etc. And then we give them a worksheet area with an exemplar. In this case, how do we align or build in SEL on this? Maybe asking politely before borrowing material. It's a way to kind of add more depth and breadth into it in a way that aligns with SEL and arguably PA career ready skills. Pre-correction for undesired student behavior. Again, walk them through some examples, some narrative precedes this, and then we give them, in this case, 2 samples of pre-correction procedures. In this case, they're both getting lining up for lunch prior to leaving the classroom and going down the hall or going wherever they're going to go for lunch. There are 2 examples or illustrations of what a pre-correction would look like. Then they're given different example situations. Some are in the classroom, some are outside of the classroom, and then they would come up with descriptions of things that they think would make sense. Achieving the 4-to-1 ratio with a targeted student. So this is focused on an individual kiddo who's struggling. And then, again, narrative precedes this. And then we walk them through some examples. We take Casey, who's a 1st grader, and we help them understand how to target the time interval for reinforcement in order to achieve the 4-to-1 ratio in Casey's case. And then they're given different scenarios with different students where they can then calculate based on the baseline, right, of the frequency of the behavior how often they would need to reinforce or catch that student doing things the right way to achieve a 4-to-1. And then similarly with OTRs, again, we break OTRs simply into the say, write, and do domains. There's tons and tons of examples of OTRs that teachers use almost intuitively on a regular basis. And then in turn, we walk them through some examples in the narrative. We give them a scenario, and then we have them target and come up with brief descriptions of that as well. And then also redirection of problem behavior. This would be with a targeted student again, perhaps a student who has a behavior support plan, for example, or perhaps a student that doesn't have a behavior support plan, maybe is involved in a behavior contract at Tier 2, or perhaps is just engaged with check-in, check-out, or some other Tier 2 intervention that kiddo is struggling. So in turn, we provide an example, like for example, Ashton yelling and screaming, the do why with a stop redirect, stop X, do Y, then reinforce, right? 3-step process. So the stop X is Ashton's yelling and screaming. The do Y statement to redirect him, take a step back and let's take 3 deep breaths together. And then we do that, and then we add additional pieces and then reinforcement on that. Again, just trying to make more tangible and concrete rather than abstract and conceptual. Issues like redirecting, issues like 4-to-1 ratio, issues like OTRs. It's stuff that all of us can generally agree on, we know is good practice. There's tons and tons of research that supports it. But the translation of that to make it tangible and in bite size, that's what was the impetus for developing these tools, to kind of make it so we could get our arms around it a little bit better on an operational level. So all of these are within this packet, which takes that next step down. So let me go all the way back to this one, just to put it all in big context again. So kind of the mothership of these tools is the baker's dozen, where all of those component parts are reflected into that. Then there are micro self-assessments for each of the core component parts, as listed here, that I talked through relatively briefly. And then beyond that, there is another level of specificity that actually provides some hypothetical situations based on a little bit of guidance given to the person to work their way through that. These are not designed in that you need to do this one, then this one, then this one. They're designed in a way that any one can stand alone independently, or you could bundle them up and use them as a package in lots and lots of different ways. So there are lots of different approaches of how you could use any of these particular component parts. Now, when we think about the core elements of these Tier 1 practices, they all align with what PDE identifies as trauma-informed approaches. PDE's definition of trauma-informed aligns with what SAMHSA and all of the other federal definitions are, except we frame it into 5 domains instead of SAMHSA's 6 domains, but essentially they reflect the same thing. Each of those core Tier 1 practices were not selected arbitrarily. They were selected intentionally to hone in on because they directly relate to at least one, if not multiple, of these 5 core domains of trauma-informed practice, dealing with safety of kids, trustworthiness of the environment and the adults working with them, collaboration and mutuality, cultural sensitivity, and empowerment, choice, and voice. All of these packaged together address these basic elements of trauma-informed practice, and the focal point of trauma-informed practice, regardless of what frameworks you work from, is addressing Maslow's hierarchy. Or if you want to look at Kohlberg or another parallel system, fine. But when you look at the basic levels of human need, we look at issues of physiology and physical needs, safety needs, love and belonging, which are the building foundation to get to esteem and self-actualization. So all of these things are deliberately aligned to do this. So with that, what I'm going to do, because we got enough time, we go to 3:15, right? Okay, cool. Just checking. What I'm going to do is have you do one more quick pair share based on kind of what you talked about before, based on what we debriefed large group. Do you have any particular questions about how to go about using these that come to mind, or any other observations you want to share? I'm going to give you about 3 to 4 minutes. Again, I'll use the same system, give you a 1-minute countdown, 30 second, 15, and then we'll go to 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay? 1. Thank you. Appreciate it. So any general either questions about application or any other comments that people want to share? I'm not going to keep you here just to keep you, but I want to address questions since we have the time. We've got a couple of minutes to work with. Please, real loud.
Do you find that it's helpful to have a video of a teacher teaching and have a modeling of how to complete the Baker's dozen before we go right directly to the teacher doing it on themselves?
So do you find it helpful to have a video, whether it's self-recorded or externally recorded, of the teacher teaching, as well as with a model, to be packaged up with use of the Baker's dozen? And that would be ideal. We know that's not always available, but yeah, absolutely. Use of self-recording and then going through and analyzing or watching one's own teaching practice with the Baker's dozen or with a micro self-assessment gets it even to a more finite or granular level. So if you can do that and you have the ability to do that, that would be a great way to even further augment the use of the tools. Absolutely. Other questions or comments or anything else for the general good? I'll be glad to hang out and talk to individual people, of course. I know one question that did come up. These recordings will be posted by Patton. They will be available to everybody since this is a recorded session. The materials that I quickly oriented you to were uploaded onto the Patton app for the conference, so they should all be there. They may not be accessible at the moment, but they will be. And then, if that's not the case, you can always just Google McDowell Institute at Bloomsburg University, come to our website, and you should be able to find those materials, or the bulk of those materials there. One of the materials is not up there yet, but it will be up there soon. So with that, have a great, oh, I'm sorry, one question. Go ahead, real loud. That's okay, no, go. Sure. So the question is the kind of the packet of resources something facilitated, if not by me, by the Institute or something? In some instances, yes, but they were designed to really be almost self-tutorial a bit. So, for example, if they can be packaged with, by an internal coach in a building, with using like a professional learning community approach, whether it's proactive or remedial, that would be ideal. But when you look at how these are designed, when you look at them closely, I could just pick it up in isolation and use it. There's more margin for error, of course, if I'm not getting coaching and guidance and I'm really struggling with an area. But if nothing else, this will at least maybe prompt me to recognize that, geez, this is an area I need to tighten up my practice on. And then I can explore what other resources would be available to me to be able to do that. Yeah. So, I mean, having that facilitation makes sense. It's helpful, especially with the coaching aspect of it. But worst case in point, if none of that is available for some reason, it still would probably be beneficial for a teacher to use this periodically to kind of self-check on their practice. Yep. Any other questions or comments? Okay, have a great conference. Thank you for coming.